Imagine a man so respected by his enemies that they wrote poems about him. A man whose opponents, the very knights and kings who fought him on the battlefield, called him noble, merciful, and just. A man who captured the holiest city in Christendom and was mourned, genuinely mourned, by the people he defeated. How does that happen? How does a Kurdish soldier from a modest family in northern Iraq become the most powerful ruler in the Islamic world, reclaim Jerusalem after nearly 90 years of Crusader rule, and then somehow emerge from all of that as a legend, not just to his own people, but to the Europeans who fought him? And here is the question that cuts even deeper. Was Saladin truly the merciful, chivalric hero that history remembers? Or has legend smoothed away the harder edges of a man who was, above all, a ruthless and calculating political survivor? And what does it tell us about the nature of power that a man could be simultaneously loved by those he conquered and feared by those who served him? Stay with us, because the story of Saladin is one of the most extraordinary in all of medieval history. And it is far stranger, far more complicated, and far more human than the legend suggests. If this kind of deep historical storytelling is what you come here for, hit subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps us keep making these videos, and it tells us you want more. To understand Saladin, you first have to understand the world he was born into, because it was a world in crisis. The year was 1137 or 1138, depending on which source you trust, and the exact date of his birth is one of those things historians acknowledge they simply cannot pin down with certainty. He was born in Tikrit, in what is now northern Iraq, into a Kurdish family of military administrators serving under the Zengid dynasty. His full name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub. Saladin, the name the whole world knows, is a Latinized version of his honorific title, Salah ad-Din, which means righteousness of the faith. His father, Najm ad-Din Ayyub, was a capable military governor, and the family moved frequently in service of their Zengid overlords. Saladin grew up not as a prince, not as a born ruler, but as the son of a loyal administrator in a deeply fragmented political landscape. And fragmented is almost too gentle a word for what the Islamic world looked like in the 12th century. Here is something that often gets lost in the popular narrative of the Crusades. The Crusaders did not arrive into a unified, monolithic Islamic civilization. They arrived into a world torn apart by rival dynasties, competing caliphates, and constant internal warfare. The Sunni Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and the Shia Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo were ideological and political enemies. The Seljuk Turks controlled much of the east. Local rulers, called atabegs, operated with enormous independence, often fighting each other as readily as they fought outsiders. When the First Crusade captured Jerusalem in 1099, the city had just changed hands from the Seljuks to the Fatimids only months earlier. The Islamic world's response to the Crusader kingdoms was, for decades, fragmented and ineffective, precisely because no single power was strong enough or motivated enough to unite the region. This is the world that shaped Saladin. Not a world of simple holy war, but a world of complex, shifting alliances, where survival required as much political skill as military talent. Now, let's address a popular myth right here, before we go further. The Crusades are often framed in modern popular culture as a clash between a unified Christian Europe and a unified Islamic Middle East. This is historically inaccurate on both sides. The Crusader states were frequently at war with each other, made alliances with Muslim rulers when it suited them, and were often abandoned by European powers that had their own priorities. And the Islamic world, as we have just seen, was anything but unified. Saladin's great achievement was not simply defeating the Crusaders. It was first unifying a deeply divided Islamic world, and that task consumed most of his life and was, in many ways, harder than anything he did on the battlefield. Saladin's rise began not in Jerusalem, not in Cairo, but in the dusty, complicated politics of Egypt. His uncle, Shirkuh, was a senior military commander under Nur ad-Din, the Zengid ruler of Syria and one of the most effective Muslim leaders of the era. Nur ad-Din had a grand strategic vision: unite Syria and Egypt under Sunni rule, and the Crusader states would be surrounded, cut off, and eventually crushed. The problem was that Egypt was ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate, a Shia dynasty that was, by the 1160s, in serious decline, its government paralyzed by internal power struggles. Between 1164 and 1169, a remarkable series of military interventions unfolded. Shirkuh led 3 separate expeditions into Egypt, partly to prevent the Crusaders from taking control of the country themselves, partly to extend Zengid influence. And on each of these expeditions, he brought his young nephew, Saladin. Saladin was, by most accounts, a reluctant participant in the Egyptian campaigns. A later source records him saying that the expedition to Egypt was the most unwelcome thing he had ever been asked to do. Whether or not those exact words are authentic, historians note that Saladin was not, in his youth, the fire-breathing warrior of legend. He was bookish, interested in theology and law, more comfortable in court than on campaign. But he was also deeply observant, and he learned. In 1169, Shirkuh finally secured Egypt, became its vizier, its chief minister, and then died just 2 months later. The Fatimid Caliph, looking for someone manageable, someone young and seemingly inexperienced who could be controlled, appointed Saladin as the new vizier. It was one of history's great miscalculations. Within 3 years, Saladin had done something that seemed almost impossible. He had abolished the Fatimid Caliphate, ending 2 centuries of Shia rule in Egypt, and realigned the country with Sunni Islam and nominal loyalty to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. He had done this not through a violent coup, but through a careful, patient dismantling of Fatimid power, replacing their officials with his own loyalists, restructuring the army, and waiting for the aging Fatimid Caliph to die without an heir in 1171. The speed and completeness of this transition astonished contemporaries. Egypt, the wealthiest country in the region, was now Saladin's, and with Egypt's resources, his ambitions could grow. But here is where the story takes a turn that many people do not expect. Saladin's next major conflict was not with the Crusaders. It was with his own nominal overlord, Nur ad-Din. The relationship between Saladin and Nur ad-Din had become deeply strained. Nur ad-Din wanted Saladin to press attacks on the Crusader states. Saladin repeatedly found reasons to delay, to consolidate, to strengthen his position in Egypt first. Historians debate whether this was strategic wisdom or something closer to insubordination. Nur ad-Din grew suspicious. Saladin grew more independent. In 1174, the crisis resolved itself in the most unexpected way. Nur ad-Din died, leaving behind a young son and a power vacuum across Syria. Within months, Saladin marched into Syria, not as a conqueror, but as a protector, claiming he was there to safeguard the young Zengid heir against the chaos of rival claimants. Over the next decade, through a combination of military campaigns, strategic marriages, diplomatic pressure, and carefully calibrated generosity, Saladin extended his control across Syria, northern Iraq, and parts of the Arabian Peninsula. He was building something new, the Ayyubid Sultanate, a unified Sunni state stretching from Egypt to the borders of Persia, and he did it, crucially, while maintaining the public posture of a holy warrior fighting for Islam. Every campaign was framed as preparation for the ultimate goal, the liberation of Jerusalem. This framing was politically brilliant. It made it extremely difficult for other Muslim rulers to openly oppose him without appearing to stand against the cause of Islam itself. But it also created an obligation. Saladin had promised jihad. Sooner or later, he would have to deliver it. By the mid-1180s, Saladin controlled a territory that encircled the Crusader states on nearly every side. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the most important of the Crusader states, was in serious internal trouble. The king, Baldwin IV, was a man of extraordinary courage and genuine political skill. But he was dying. He suffered from leprosy, a disease that was slowly destroying his body throughout his reign. He ruled from behind a mask in his later years, his hands and face ravaged by the illness. Yet he continued to lead armies and govern with remarkable effectiveness. Historians have noted that Baldwin IV was one of the most formidable opponents Saladin ever faced, and his death in 1185 removed the one figure who had consistently managed to hold the kingdom together. After Baldwin's death, the kingdom fell into a succession crisis. A faction of the nobility supported Guy of Lusignan, an ambitious but militarily inexperienced nobleman who had married into the royal family. Another faction, led by the experienced Count Raymond III of Tripoli, recognized that Guy was dangerously unqualified for the crisis ahead. Into this divided, weakened kingdom, Saladin was looking for his moment. The trigger came from one of history's great villains, or at least one of history's great provocateurs, Reynaud of Chatillon, the lord of a castle called Kerak, in what is now Jordan. Reynaud was, by any measure, a problem. He had spent years conducting raids on Muslim caravans and pilgrimage routes, in direct violation of truces that the Kingdom of Jerusalem had negotiated with Saladin. He had even at one point launched a naval expedition into the Red Sea, threatening the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, an act that genuinely horrified the Islamic world and enraged Saladin personally. In late 1186 or early 1187, Reynold attacked another Muslim caravan, reportedly including members of Saladin's own family, though historians note some uncertainty about the exact composition of the caravan. This was the provocation Saladin had been waiting for, or perhaps the provocation he had been hoping someone would provide. He declared war. What followed in the summer of 1187 was one of the most decisive military campaigns in medieval history. Saladin assembled an army that contemporary sources estimate at somewhere between 12,000 and 30,000 men, though precise figures from this period are notoriously unreliable. He crossed the Jordan River and laid siege to the city of Tiberias, on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. This was a trap, and Raymond of Tripoli recognized it immediately. Tiberias was Raymond's own city, and his wife was inside it. Yet Raymond stood before the council of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and argued against every instinct of chivalric honor that they should not march to relieve Tiberias. The army should stay in its fortified position. Let Saladin take the city. The army was more important than any single town. Guy of Lusignan initially agreed. Then, in the night, he changed his mind. Accounts differ on exactly what persuaded him, but by morning, the decision had reversed. The army would march. It was a fatal error. On the 4th of July, 1187, the Crusader army marched across the arid plateau toward Tiberias in the full heat of Assyrian summer. Saladin's forces harassed them constantly, cutting off their access to water, setting fire to the dry grass to send smoke into their faces. By the time the army reached a pair of rocky hills called the Horns of Hattin, the men and horses were desperate with thirst, barely able to fight. Saladin had chosen his ground perfectly. The Battle of Hattin was not really a battle. It was a collapse. The Crusader army, one of the largest the kingdom had ever assembled, disintegrated under the heat, the thirst, and the relentless pressure of Saladin's forces. Guy of Lusignan was captured. Raymond of Tripoli escaped, but he died shortly afterward, reportedly broken by what had happened. The true cross, the most sacred relic in the kingdom, believed by the Crusaders to be a fragment of the cross on which Christ was crucified, was captured, and Reynold of Chatillon was brought before Saladin in his tent. What happened next became one of the most famous moments of the entire crusading era. Saladin offered water to Guy of Lusignan, the captured king. Guy drank and then passed the cup to Reynold. According to the account that has come down through history, Saladin said that he had not given water to Reynold, meaning he was not bound by the custom of hospitality that protected a guest. He then killed Reynold himself. Historians note that this account appears in multiple sources, though as with many such dramatic moments from this period, we cannot be certain of every detail. What is not disputed is that Reynold was killed and Guy was spared. The message was deliberate and precise. Saladin kept his promises and settled his debts. With the Crusader army destroyed, the cities of the kingdom fell in rapid succession. Acre, Jaffa, Ascalon, one after another. By September of 1187, Saladin stood before the walls of Jerusalem. The siege of Jerusalem lasted from the 20th of September to the 2nd of October, 1187. And what happened during those 2 weeks became the foundation of Saladin's legend. The city was defended by Balian of Ibelin, a nobleman who had entered Jerusalem to escort his wife to safety and found himself, almost by accident, in command of the defense. He had, by some accounts, only 2 knights with him. The population included thousands of civilians, pilgrims, and refugees who had fled from across the kingdom. Balian negotiated with Saladin, and Saladin agreed to terms. Every Christian in Jerusalem could leave safely. Ransoms would be paid for those who could afford them and for those who could not. Saladin and his brother reportedly paid the ransoms themselves for thousands of the poor. The city was not sacked. The churches were not destroyed. The population was not massacred. Compare this to 1099, when the Crusaders had captured Jerusalem. Contemporary accounts, including those written by the Crusaders themselves, describe a massacre of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. The scale of that massacre is debated by historians, and some of the more extreme figures in medieval sources are likely exaggerated, but the contrast with Saladin's conduct in 1187 was stark and was noticed immediately by contemporaries on both sides. Saladin's entry into Jerusalem on the 2nd of October, 1187, coincided with a date of deep significance in Islamic tradition, the anniversary of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey to Jerusalem. Whether this was calculated or coincidental, it was received as a sign of divine favor, and Saladin understood the power of that symbolism. The news of Jerusalem's fall sent shockwaves through Europe. Pope Gregory VIII issued a papal bull calling for a new crusade. Three of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, King Richard I of England, King Philip II of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, took the cross. The Third Crusade had begun. Frederick Barbarossa drowned crossing a river in Anatolia in 1190, and most of his massive army dissolved after his death. Philip II of France arrived, quarrelled with Richard, and went home. But Richard I of England, who history would call Richard the Lionheart, arrived in the Holy Land in 1191 and proved to be something else entirely. The contest between Saladin and Richard I is one of the great military duels of the medieval world, and it is remarkable for something beyond the battles themselves. Richard was a superb military commander, arguably the finest battlefield general of his era. He retook Acre after a long siege. He defeated Saladin's army at the Battle of Arsuf, a victory that demonstrated his extraordinary ability to maintain discipline under pressure. He marched his army down the coast in a formation so tight and so disciplined that Saladin's cavalry could not break it, despite constant attacks. But Richard could not take Jerusalem. He came within sight of the city twice. Both times he turned back, because he understood as a strategist that even if he captured Jerusalem, he could not hold it. His army would go home. The city would fall again. The problem was not the walls of Jerusalem. The problem was the entire strategic situation, and Saladin, for his part, could not drive Richard into the sea. The two men were, in a sense, perfectly matched. Neither could destroy the other. Both were running out of time. Saladin was exhausted, his treasury strained, his coalition of emirs increasingly restless. Richard had political problems at home, with his brother John causing trouble in England and Philip of France eyeing his territories in France. In September of 1192, they negotiated the Treaty of Jaffa. The Crusaders would keep the coastal cities they had retaken. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims would have the right to visit the holy sites peacefully. It was, in many ways, a compromise that satisfied neither side completely, but it was a peace that both sides needed. Here is one of the most remarkable details of the entire period, a genuine wow fact that stops people in their tracks when they first hear it. During the campaign, when Richard fell ill with fever, Saladin reportedly sent him fresh fruit and ice from the mountains to cool his fever. When Richard's horse was killed in battle, Saladin sent him a replacement. These gestures were reported by sources on both sides and were understood at the time as expressions of chivalric respect between two warriors who recognized each other's quality. They never met in person. But in their exchange of messengers, gifts, and negotiated terms, something unusual happened. A mutual respect formed between two men who were, by any definition, enemies. Richard reportedly said that if he could not have Jerusalem himself, there was no man on earth he would rather have it than Saladin. Whether those exact words were spoken, we cannot confirm. But the sentiment was recorded by contemporaries, and it tells us something important about how both men understood the conflict they were engaged in. Saladin did not live long after the treaty. He returned to Damascus in the autumn of 1192, and by the following February, he was dead. He was somewhere between 54 and 56 years old. The manner of his death became as legendary as his life. When his treasury was inventoried after his death, there was almost nothing in it. A man who had controlled the wealth of Egypt and Syria, who had commanded armies numbering in the tens of thousands, died with barely enough money to pay for his own funeral. He had given it away to his soldiers, to the poor, to mosques and schools and public works. Historians note that this account, while broadly consistent across multiple sources, may have been somewhat embellished in the retelling, as accounts of great men's deaths often are. But the core fact that Saladin died with remarkably little personal wealth for a man of his power is not seriously disputed. His biographer, Bahar ad-Din ibn Shaddad, who knew him personally, wrote an account of his final days, that is one of the most moving documents of the medieval Islamic world. He described a man at peace, whose lips moved in prayer as he drifted in and out of consciousness, who died, in the words of his biographer, as a Muslim should. The Ayyubid Sultanate he had built fragmented after his death, divided among his sons and brothers, according to his own wishes. This, too, is a revealing detail. Saladin did not try to build a permanent centralized empire. He distributed power among his family, perhaps understanding that the unity he had achieved was personal, built on his own reputation and relationships, and could not simply be inherited. So why does Saladin's legend endure? Why, 8 centuries later, is he still a figure invoked by leaders, celebrated in literature and film, and studied by historians across the world? Part of the answer is straightforward. He won. He recaptured Jerusalem. In the Islamic world, he became the model of the just ruler, the holy warrior who combined military genius with personal piety and generosity. His name became synonymous with the possibility of Muslim unity and strength. But the more interesting question is why he became a legend in Europe as well. And the answer to that reveals something important about how legends are made. The Crusaders needed Saladin to be noble. If their great enemy was a barbarian, a monster, then their own defeat was simply humiliation. But if their enemy was a great man, a man of honor and chivalry, then their defeat was something they could live with, even something they could respect. The European image of Saladin as a chivalric hero was, in part, a psychological necessity for the people who lost to him. This does not mean the image was false. The evidence for Saladin's genuine magnanimity, his keeping of promises, his treatment of prisoners and civilians, is strong and comes from multiple independent sources. But it does mean that the legend was shaped by the needs of those who told it, on both sides. There is also a harder question that honest history has to ask. Saladin was not simply a gentle philosopher king. He was a man who ordered the execution of prisoners after the Battle of Hattin, specifically the military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, who were considered the most dangerous and implacable enemies of the Muslim cause. He conducted campaigns that caused enormous suffering. He was a master of political manipulation who spent years carefully maneuvering rivals out of power. The Saladin of legend is a simplified version of a complex man. The real Saladin was someone who could show extraordinary mercy in one moment and cold political calculation in the next. He was, in other words, a human being navigating an extraordinarily difficult world, doing what he believed was right within the moral framework of his time, which was not our time, and should not be judged as if it were. What makes him remarkable is not that he was perfect. It is that in a world of extraordinary brutality on all sides, he consistently chose, often at political cost, to honor his word, to spare civilians when he could, and to treat his enemies with a dignity that was genuinely unusual for the era. His legacy echoes forward in ways that are still visible today. The borders of the modern Middle East, the fault lines between Sunni and Shia Islam, the unresolved questions of Jerusalem's status, these are all, in different ways, connected to the world Saladin navigated. He did not create these divisions, but he shaped how they played out across centuries. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as Arab and Muslim nationalism emerged as political forces, Saladin was repeatedly invoked as a model. Leaders across the region claimed his legacy, sometimes in ways that had more to do with political convenience than historical accuracy. The distance between the historical Saladin and the Saladin of modern political rhetoric is vast, and historians have sometimes struggled to reclaim the real man from the symbol. In Western culture, Saladin appears in the works of Dante, who placed him in limbo among the virtuous non-Christians, a remarkable honor for a medieval European poet to bestow on an Islamic ruler. He appears in the novels of Walter Scott. He appears in countless films and television series. The image of him as a noble, chivalric figure has proven extraordinarily durable across 8 centuries of European culture, and Jerusalem itself, the city at the heart of his story, remains contested, sacred, and unresolved. The questions that Saladin and Richard Farf were unable to answer in 192. Questions about who has the right to the city, how its holy sites should be governed, how different faiths can share a space that each considers uniquely theirs, those questions are still with us. Saladin did not solve them. He could not. But the way he handled his moment of victory, entering Jerusalem not as a conqueror seeking revenge, but as a ruler seeking legitimacy, choosing peace over massacre, choosing to build rather than destroy, That choice has echoed through history in ways that still matter. There is a final image worth holding on to. In the spring of 1193, in a garden in Damascus, a Kurdish boy who had grown up to rule an empire lay dying. He had spent his life in motion, always campaigning, always building, always negotiating. Now he was still. His biographer sat with him in those final days and recorded his last words and gestures. What strikes the reader across 8 centuries is not the grandeur but the simplicity. A man who had held Jerusalem, who had faced the greatest warriors of medieval Europe and held his own, who had built a sultanate from nothing, was at the end just a man, tired and sick, murmuring prayers in a garden. The legend that grew from that life is, like all legends, partly true and partly constructed. But the core of it, the idea that a person of genuine ability and genuine integrity can rise from modest origins to reshape the world, and can do so while remaining, by the standards of his time, recognizably decent, that part of the legend is real. And perhaps that is why, 800 years later, both the people he fought for and the people he fought against still find something worth remembering in his name. What do you think was the more powerful force in Saladin's rise? His military genius, or his ability to make even his enemies respect him? That is a genuine question, and the answer is not obvious. Write your thoughts in the comments, because the best discussions on this channel happen down there. If you appreciate history told this way, without the myths and without the filler, subscribe. It takes about 3 seconds, and it is the single most important thing you can do to help us keep making these videos. In the next video, we are going to look at the Third Crusade from the other side, the story of Richard the Lionheart, a king who never really wanted to be a king, who fought the greatest campaign of his life, thousands of miles from home, and who returned to find his kingdom nearly stolen from under him. That story is coming soon, and you will not want to miss it.